On October 27, 1858, the world welcomed a new member. Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished. That new member of the human family was Theodore Roosevelt, born in New York City. There was no indication at the beginning of the tremendous influence, not only in America but worldwide, and the legacy that Roosevelt would lead at that particular time. In fact, just the opposite was the case. Roosevelt was rather weak. He was also plagued with a great many physical infirmities, and he was frail. But he didn't let his infirmity stand in the way of his rendezvous with destiny. He undertook what we might call the strenuous life, a vigorous program of exercise and of therapy in order to overcome his infirmities. He went on to graduate from Harvard and then enter politics. He became an assemblyman in New York, governor of New York, and finally he entered the world stage as the running mate of then President William McKinley. He was the vice president with McKinley. They were elected, and a year after they assumed office, President McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt became the president, served out McKinley's term, and then won election on his own merits and his own programs. The influence of Theodore Roosevelt in the mind of many Americans goes back to the idea that here was a guy who spoke softly and carried a big stick. I think history tells us that he was more comfortable with the big stick than he was in speaking softly. This is especially true when it came to monopolies and the influence of big government, and often the lack of concern for workers and working conditions, the poor. In many ways, we could call Roosevelt a progressive, even before Woodrow Wilson became the kind of model of progressivism. However, it ought to be clear that Roosevelt was not an ideologue. He grew up in the time when America was flexing its muscles. It was becoming industrial. It was expanding. It was growing, not only nationally, but internationally. And Roosevelt recognized the need and the importance of expansion. He often said, we have a responsibility and a right to use the magnificent resources that God has given to America for the development and progress of America, but not to waste them. That was his concern, use but not abuse. And Roosevelt became known as the conservation president, and with good reason. While in office, he established 230 million acres of public lands so that people could go, the public could use them. They had access to enjoy them with their families and to see the beauty and the power of nature. He established 155 national and state parks around the country, wildlife preserves, animal preserves. He also instituted the United States Forest Service. Roosevelt became enamored. He became under the spell of nature, and especially of the West, and the beautiful natural monuments that nature afforded. And it became a kind of religious or mystical experience for him. He often talked about the mystery of being in the presence of nature, its quiet, its silence, and the ability to absorb that. He said, I cannot explain it in words, the feeling that I get in the midst of nature, to the wild outdoors. And he saw that as a tremendous gift to the American people. And he said one time that as he was walking with the redwoods and the sequoias, he said, it's like being in a cathedral. It's a sacred experience. But again, and it's important to emphasize this, Roosevelt was not an ideologue. He was not either or. He was concerned with industrialization, with development, but he wanted to do it as a good steward. He wanted to care for it. Why? So that other generations could participate. He had a beautiful expression. He said, "We must never forget those who are in the womb of time." Isn't that a beautiful expression? The womb of time. That is, those who will come after us. In other words, we're just caretakers. We're borrowing it. But we have a responsibility to pass this on to other people, to other generations, so that the beauty and the experience that we have can go to others. In many ways, he was a kind of naturalist mystic. It elevated his soul and his spirit. And he said, those who cannot experience the wonder of nature are as poor as those who do not take delight in books. He had both of those together. And to show that he was also an American pragmatist and practical, he said, "Be generous with your ideals, but always keep your feet on the ground." And it was that kind of balance, that integration, that so highlighted the life and the activity of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was also a person who advocated what he called the square deal. He believed that the human environment and the non-human environment were interconnected. It's not either or. You don't sacrifice one for the other. That in effect, what happens in nature affects the human environment, and the human environment and the way in which we live affects nature. That's why he was a great advocate for fairness, for a square deal. When it came in dealing with the poor, the urban worker, for those who had to work in factories to make sure they had the proper working hours, working conditions, medical care. He saw life and this tremendous gift of creation as interconnected, not separate, not competing, but they were complementary. And that's the tremendous vision he had. And as all great leaders, Roosevelt was not stuck in his own generation, in his own time. He had a very long vision, a very long vision. And of all the things that Theodore Roosevelt did, his legacy, from Mount Rushmore to the various labor laws that he had enacted, to his version of a strong America in the world, the legacy that probably touches us most intimately and directly is his fervent desire for conservation, for the development and preservation of this beauty that God has shed on America. He wanted that. And I think where Roosevelt's legacy touches us most deeply and personally is whenever we ride through a state or national park, whenever we gaze at a mountain, we see a stream, we see a magnificent tree, a sunrise and a sunset, or the starry heavens at night. Those things remind us of just how precious they are. They were precious, and they were a part of the American legacy that Roosevelt wanted to preserve and pass on to us and to those who come after us in the womb of time. Now, several decades later, I think Roosevelt would have found much to discuss and much to agree with a Pope, Pope Francis, who has a very keen commitment and interest in the question of what he calls integral ecology, the human and the non-human working to the glory of God. In our next video, we are going to introduce you to this Pope Francis, and his love for creation, much as Theodore Roosevelt's love and reverence for what God has given us. Hope to see you next time.